Get back! It'll tear your throat out!" The beta's voice cracked, echoing off the blood-spattered marble of the compound. In the center of the ruined courtyard, the Alpha King's beast paced. A massive, night-black terror, its fur matted with the gore of a battle they had barely survived. 3 top healers already lay groaning, thrown aside when they tried to approach. The wolf snarled, a bone-rattling sound that paralyzed the onlookers. It hadn't let anyone touch the blood before. It was waiting to die, or kill again. Lisa picked up the tin bucket of warm water and a rough linen cloth. "Lisa, don't," a guard whispered. She stepped over the threshold. "He's drowning in it," she said softly. "Someone has to." The courtyard of the high-security compound was silent, save for the ragged, wet breathing of the Alpha King. Overhead, the security floodlights buzzed, casting harsh, clinical shadows across the shattered glass and overturned tactical vehicles that littered the estate. The battle was over, but the war still lingered in the air, thick and metallic with the scent of copper, adrenaline, and torn earth. Lisa's sneakers made soft, damp sounds as she stepped away from the safety of the reinforced steel doors. She was human, a rarity permitted within the inner sanctum only because of her unparalleled skill as a trauma nurse. She possessed no wolf to submit to the towering creature before her, no inherent instinct telling her to drop to her knees and bare her neck. All she had was a tin bucket, a coarse linen cloth, and an unnatural stillness that had kept her alive in this violent world. The beast stopped pacing. It was the size of a grizzly bear, an ancient, terrifying manifestation of pure, predatory instinct. Its eyes, glowing a radioactive gold in the dim light, locked onto her. A low, vibrating growl started in its chest, a frequency that made the water in Lisa's bucket ripple. Every muscle in the creature's body was coiled tight, ready to spring. It was covered entirely in blood. Some of it was dry and crusted black. Some of it was fresh, dripping from its jaws, and the jagged tears in its thick pelt. "Hold your fire!" Marcus, the beta, hissed from the balcony above. His rifle was trained on his own king. It was pack law. If an alpha lost himself to the beast after a massacre and turned on his own, he had to be put down. Lisa didn't look up at Marcus. She kept her eyes on the wolf. "Lower the gun, Marcus," she said, her voice carrying a calm, steady cadence that cut through the panic of the courtyard. "You're aggravating him, Lisa. He just broke Silas's arm for holding a syringe. He doesn't know who we are right now." "He knows," Lisa murmured, taking another step. "He just doesn't care." She stopped 3 feet from the beast. The smell was overpowering. Musk, iron, and the sharp, acidic tang of burnt gunpowder. Up close, she could see the trembling in the creature's massive forelegs. It wasn't just rage keeping it on its feet. It was sheer, agonizing stubbornness. Lisa slowly lowered the bucket to the ground. The metal scraped against the marble, a sharp sound that caused the wolf to snap its jaws together with a loud clack, a warning bite at the empty air. Lisa didn't flinch. She knelt, her knees pressing into the cold, sticky stone. "I know," she whispered, keeping her hands visible. "I know it hurts." She dipped the linen cloth into the warm water, wringing it out with slow, deliberate motions. She wasn't an alpha. She wasn't a beta. She was just Lisa. But in her trauma ward, she was God. She dictated who lived and who died, based on her hands and her calm. She applied that same clinical sovereignty now. She reached out. The crowd behind the steel doors collectively gasped. The beast lunged, its massive jaws opening to close around her arm. Lisa didn't pull back. She didn't scream. She simply froze, letting the wolf's teeth rest against the fragile skin of her forearm. The heat radiating from its mouth was intense. 1 millimeter of pressure, and her arm would be severed. She met the beast's golden eyes. She didn't offer dominance nor submission. She offered a boundary. "No," she said, firmly, like she was reprimanding a patient pulling at an IV line. For a terrible, stretched second, the courtyard held its breath. The wolf's eyes flickered. The feral, unblinking stare broke, replaced by a profound, exhaustion-laced confusion. Slowly, agonizingly, it released her arm and let out a huff of hot air that smelled of copper. It lowered its massive head, resting its chin heavily onto its front paws, its golden eyes never leaving her face. Lisa exhaled a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. She moved her hand forward and pressed the warm, wet cloth against the thick fur of its neck. The beast shuddered. It was a full-body tremor, a violently repressed flinch. It hadn't let anyone touch the blood before because the blood was its armor. By washing it away, Lisa was exposing whatever lay beneath. She dragged the cloth down, the water instantly turning a dark, muddy crimson. She rinsed the cloth, wrung it out, and wiped again. Over and over, the rhythmic splash of water and the rough slide of linen were the only sounds in the compound. As she worked, washing the gore from the beast's shoulders, she felt the rigid, defensive muscles beneath the pelt begin to soften. The growling faded into a low, rhythmic wheeze. She was stripping away the monster, stroke by stroke, waiting to see what kind of man was left behind. The water in the bucket was no longer water. It was a dark, viscous slurry. Lisa ignored the ache in her knees and the cold seeping through her jeans. She worked with methodical precision, moving from the beast's broad neck down to the terrifying expanse of its chest. With every pass of the warm cloth, the air around them seemed to thicken. The temperature in the immediate radius spiked, a localized fever that made Lisa sweat. She knew what this was. The adrenaline was finally leaving his system. The beast could no longer sustain itself. The wolf let out a sharp, whining exhale that sounded disturbingly human. Then, the bones began to break. It was a horrific sound, the wet crunch and snap of a skeletal structure rearranging itself in real time. Lisa stayed exactly where she was, averting her eyes to give him the dignity of his agonizing transformation. But she didn't retreat. Steam rolled off his body, smelling of ozone and burning pine. The massive black shape shrank, contorted, and flattened against the bloody marble. When the sickening sound ceased, the heavy, ragged breathing of a man replaced the wheezing of the wolf. Lisa slowly turned her head. David lay curled on his side, his knees drawn toward his chest. The Alpha King was naked, shivering violently despite the sweat slicking his heavily muscled skin. The blood that had matted the wolf's fur now coated human skin like a horrific second skin. Scars, both old and impossibly fresh, mapped his torso and back. He looked entirely broken. The terrifying tyrant who ruled the northern territories with an iron fist, the man who commanded armies and brokered ruthless treaties, was shivering on the floor like a dying ember. Lisa reached for a thick wool blanket she had draped over her shoulder. She unfolded it and gently laid it over his lower half. As she leaned in to drape the fabric, David's hand shot out. His fingers wrapped around her wrist like a steel vise. Lisa gasped, the pain immediate and blinding. His eyes snapped open. They were no longer gold, but a deep, storm cloud gray. However, the feral emptiness was still there. He was looking at her, but he wasn't seeing her. He was seeing the battlefield. "David," she said sharply, keeping her voice low so the men on the balcony couldn't hear his weakness. "David, you're home. Let me go." His grip tightened. His jaw clenched, a muscle feathering wildly in his cheek. He was fighting a phantom war in his mind. They waited, he rasped. His voice was a wreck, torn to shreds by the beast's roaring. "In the gorge." "I know," Lisa said smoothly, leaning closer, refusing to pull against his grip. Pulling would trigger the predator. Pressing in triggered the man. You survived it. You brought them back. Not all of them. David blinked, the fog slowly receding from his gray eyes. Focus snapped into place, sharp and sudden. He looked at the pale hand gripping her bruised wrist, then slowly traced his gaze up her arm to her face. Recognition dawned, followed immediately by a flash of guarded hostility. He dropped her wrist. "What are you doing here?" he gritted out, pushing himself up onto one elbow. The movement pulled at a deep, jagged laceration across his ribs, and he let out a sharp hiss of pain. "Keeping your beta from putting a silver bullet in your head," Lisa replied evenly. She dipped a fresh cloth into a secondary bucket of clean water she had brought out. "Lie still." "I don't need a human playing nursemaid," he snapped, trying to sit up fully. "Get out. Send Silas. Silas is in the infirmary because you shattered his humerus when he tried to help you," Lisa said, her tone devoid of pity. She pressed the warm, clean cloth directly against the laceration on his ribs. David flinched violently, his breath catching, but he didn't pull away. "You're a mess, David," she continued, her hands moving expertly over the wound, clearing away the debris and assessing the depth. "You've been out there for 3 days. You shift-locked. If you don't let me clean this, it will fester, shifter healing or not." He glared at her, his chest heaving under her hands. The proximity was dangerous. He was an alpha, fueled by testosterone, violence, and the lingering echoes of battle. She was entirely soft, entirely vulnerable, and intimately close. The tension crackled between them, thick and suffocating. He stared at her mouth, then up to her eyes, his jaw locked tight. He didn't order her away again. He just let his head fall back against the marble, staring up at the harsh floodlights. "Make it quick," he whispered. Lisa didn't reply. She just kept washing. As the grime and blood washed away, she noticed the pattern of the wounds, deep claw marks on his shoulders, a bite radius on his thigh. But it was the bruising around his throat that made her pause. The bruising was shaped like human hands, not paws. And the blood coating his chest, the blood he had protected so fiercely as a wolf, wasn't enemy blood. It smelled like his own pack. The heavy steel doors of the courtyard groaned open before Lisa could finish binding David's ribs. A flood of tactical flashlights swept across the marble, settling directly on the two of them. Heavy boots echoed loudly. Marcus, the beta, strode forward, flanked by 3 elder members of the Pack Council. They wore impeccably tailored suits that looked absurd against the backdrop of the ruined compound. They were the politicians. David was the sword. Lisa immediately stepped back, lowering her head slightly. It was a calculated move. She wasn't submitting, but she knew how to play the game to avoid drawing their ire. Marcus stopped a few feet away, his eyes scanning David's battered, blanket-wrapped form. The beta's face was an unreadable mask of stoicism, but Lisa saw the tension in his shoulders. "Alpha," Marcus said, his voice carrying a deliberate, carrying volume. "You are returned to us." David didn't stand. He remained seated on the marble floor, the wool blanket pulled up to his waist, his freshly bandaged chest rising and falling slowly. Even sitting down, covered in bruises and half-naked, he projected a lethal, suffocating authority. He didn't look at Marcus. He looked at the 3 council elders. "I am," David said. His voice was a low rumble, devoid of the exhaustion Lisa had heard moments ago. He was putting the armor back on. "The ridge was a slaughter," Elder Thomas said, his thin lips pulled into a tight line. "We lost contact with your vanguard 2 days ago. We assumed the rogue factions had overwhelmed you. Yet you return alone, in a beast frenzy, nearly killing our best healers." "The rogues were dealt with," David said flatly. "And the vanguard?" Marcus asked softly. David's jaw tightened. "Dead. All of them." A heavy silence fell over the courtyard. 30 elite fighters. Gone. Lisa watched the subtle shift in the council member's body language. It wasn't grief, it was calculation. "How?" Elder Thomas demanded. "30 of our best. You are the Alpha King. How do 30 men fall to unorganized rogues while you walk away?" "They weren't unorganized," David said, his eyes finally locking onto Marcus. "They knew our routes. They knew our shift rotations. It was an ambush." "A leak?" Marcus frowned, stepping forward. "Impossible. Only the Council and the Vanguard commanders knew the exact coordinates." "Then someone," David said softly, the danger in his voice making the hair on Lisa's arms stand up, "talked." The accusation hung in the air, heavy and lethal. The elders bristled, offended, while Marcus merely narrowed his eyes. Lisa realized she was standing in the middle of a political powder keg. She needed to leave. She turned back to her supplies, kneeling to gather the bloody cloths and the 2 buckets of fouled water. "Leave the human, David," Elder Thomas snapped, suddenly gesturing toward Lisa. "This is pack business. She has no place here, let alone touching you." David's gaze shifted to Lisa. For a fraction of a second, the cold alpha mask slipped, revealing the exhausted man beneath. Then the mask slammed back into place. "She was doing her job when the rest of you were cowering behind reinforced glass," David said smoothly. "But you're right. She's done." He looked at her. "Get out, Lisa." The dismissal was harsh, a verbal slap designed to sever their brief connection in front of his men. Lisa felt a flare of irritation, but she swallowed it. She grabbed the handles of the buckets. "Yes, Alpha," she murmured mechanically. She turned and walked toward the infirmary wing. As she reached the shadows of the corridor, out of sight of the floodlights, she paused to balance the heavy buckets. The water in the first bucket was thick and dark, with the blood she had washed from his chest. Something clinked against the tin. Lisa frowned, setting the buckets down. She reached her gloved hand into the cold, murky water of the first bucket, fishing around the bottom. Her fingers brushed against cold, hard metal. She pulled it out. It was a small, heavy silver clasp, a cloak pin shaped like a howling wolf with a sapphire eye. Lisa's blood ran cold. She recognized this pin. Every ranking member of the pack had a distinct variation. This specific sapphire eye belonged to only one family line. She looked back toward the courtyard, where Marcus was currently leaning over David, offering him a hand up. Marcus, whose son was one of the Vanguard commanders supposedly killed by rogues. Lisa stared at the pin in her hand, the realization hitting her like a physical blow. The blood on David's chest, the blood he had protected in his beast form, the blood he refused to let anyone touch, wasn't rogue blood. It was the blood of Marcus's son. And based on the hand-shaped bruises on David's throat, the Vanguard hadn't been killed by an ambush. They had mutinied, and the Alpha King had slaughtered his own men. The infirmary was a sterile sanctuary of gleaming chrome, white linoleum, and the sharp, chemical bite of antiseptic. It was a jarring contrast to the slaughterhouse of the courtyard. Lisa stood over the deep stainless steel sink, the water running scalding hot over her trembling hands. In her right pocket, the silver cloak pin felt heavier than a lead weight. The sapphire eye of the wolf seemed to burn through the fabric of her scrubs. Marcus's son, Elias, dead. Not by rogue claws, but by the hands of the king who currently sat on exam table 3. "Lisa." The voice was a low, grating rasp. She turned off the faucet, dried her hands with practiced, deliberate slowness, and turned around. David sat on the edge of the examination table. He had discarded the blood-soaked wool blanket for a pair of gray surgical sweatpants, but his torso remained bare, a canvas of brutalized muscle and deep lacerations. Under the harsh, unforgiving fluorescent lights, the true extent of his injuries was horrifying. Yet he sat perfectly upright, his spine a steel rod, his gray eyes tracking her every movement with unsettling intensity. Marcus stood rigidly by the door, his arms crossed over his chest. He looked less like a beta guarding his king and more like a warden watching a volatile prisoner. "The bleeding has slowed," Lisa said, keeping her voice perfectly clinical. She pulled a rolling tray of sterilized instruments closer to the table. "But the laceration on your ribs requires deep tissue sutures. Your shifter healing is suppressing the surface bleeding, but you're tearing muscle every time you draw a full breath. Do it," David commanded. Lisa picked up a syringe of local anesthetic. "No," David said, his hand shooting out to hover inches from hers. He didn't touch her, but the radiant heat of his skin made her pause. "No painkillers. I need a clear head." "Alpha, this is a 5-inch dermal tear," Lisa warned, meeting his gaze. "It goes down to the fascia. If you flinch, I could sever a nerve." "I won't flinch," he replied. His eyes were cold, hollow vaults. Lisa nodded once. She set the syringe down and picked up the curved suturing needle. As she leaned in, the intoxicating, overwhelming scent of him washed over her. Pine needles, ozone, and the dark, musky scent of a predator pushed to its absolute limit. She focused entirely on the torn flesh, her gloved hands moving with swift, merciless precision. She pushed the needle through his skin. David didn't make a sound. His jaw locked so tightly she heard the joints pop, and his hands gripped the edge of the metal table until the steel actually groaned under the pressure, but his breathing remained shallow and steady. "Did you find him?" Marcus's voice broke the silence, thick with a poorly concealed tremor. Lisa's needle stalled for a fraction of a second. She felt David's abdominal muscles instantly turn to stone beneath her wrist. "The vanguard was scattered, Marcus," David said, his voice terrifyingly calm. He didn't look at his beta. He kept his eyes fixed on the blank wall behind Lisa. "Elias is a commander," Marcus pressed, stepping away from the door. The grief in the older wolf's voice was raw and bleeding. "He wouldn't scatter. He would hold the line. Did you see his body, David? I need to know if my son is lying in the mud." Lisa pulled the suture thread tight. David's pulse was hammering against her knuckles. The proximity allowed her to feel what Marcus couldn't see. The Alpha King was vibrating with a violently suppressed panic. "The gorge was dark," David lied smoothly, the deception sliding off his tongue like venom. "There were too many. I shifted to cover their retreat, but the rogues flanked us. By the time the beast took over, I lost sight of Elias. I'm sorry, Marcus. It was a masterclass in manipulation, utilizing the beast's legendary blind rage as an alibi. But Lisa had felt the hand-shaped bruises on his throat. Wolves didn't choke each other in a frenzy. Men did." Marcus let out a ragged breath, running a hand over his face. "I will organize a retrieval team at first light. We bring our boys home." "No." David's command cracked through the room like a whip. "The territory is still unstable. The rogues may have laid traps. You will wait for my explicit order." Marcus bristled, his eyes flashing amber for a split second, a dangerous challenge from a beta. "My son is out there, and your king is right here, giving you an order," David growled, the ambient temperature in the room spiking. "His heart rate is dangerously erratic," Lisa interrupted sharply, stepping squarely between David's line of sight and Marcus. She glared at the beta. "If he forces a shift in his healing cycle right now to assert dominance, he will hemorrhage internally. Get out, Marcus. Let him heal." Marcus stared at Lisa, his lip curling slightly at taking orders from a human. But the medical monitors blipping wildly beside the bed supported her claim. He swallowed his pride, bowed his head stiffly. "Yes, Alpha." The moment the door clicked shut behind Marcus, the suffocating pressure in the room snapped. David slumped forward, his forehead coming to rest against Lisa's shoulder. Lisa froze. The Alpha King's weight against her was immense, his skin burning through the thin cotton of her scrubs. He was breathing heavily, ragged gasps that sounded like a man drowning on dry land. The untouchable tyrant had shattered the moment his audience left. She didn't push him away. She simply raised her sterile, gloved hands to keep them from touching his unbandaged skin. "They're going to find out," David whispered against her collarbone. It wasn't a confession. It was a morbid realization. "When they find the bodies, they'll see the claw marks aren't from rogues." Slowly, Lisa stepped back. David let her go, his head snapping up, the vulnerability instantly replaced by guarded suspicion. He watched her as she walked over to the stainless steel counter. She reached into her pocket. Her fingers closed around the cold metal. She turned around and tossed the silver pin onto the metal tray. It landed with a sharp, damning clink that echoed off the tiled walls. The sapphire eye gleamed under the fluorescent lights. David stared at the pin. The color drained from his face, leaving him a sickly, ash gray. For 3 seconds, absolute silence reigned. Then, he moved. It was a blur of motion, too fast for human eyes to track. Before Lisa could even gasp, David had crossed the room, his hand wrapped around her throat, not squeezing, but pinning her firmly against the cold tiled wall. His forearm braced against her collar, his gray eyes swirling with the chaotic, violent gold of his wolf. "Where did you get that?" he snarled, his face inches from hers. The beast was right beneath the surface, terrified and cornered. "In the bucket," Lisa choked out, keeping her hands open and flat against the wall, projecting zero threat. "When I washed the blood off your chest, it was tangled in your fur." David's breathing was erratic, his chest heaving against hers. He looked at her throat, at the fragile pulse beating wildly beneath his palm. He could crush her windpipe with a twitch of his fingers. She was the only liability, the only loose end that could destroy his kingdom. "Kill me, and you'll bleed out on this floor in 10 minutes, she said softly, her voice remarkably steady despite the terror spiking in her veins. "And then Marcus will lead the retrieval team, find his son with his throat ripped out by an alpha's jaws, and your entire pack will burn in a civil war." David's jaw trembled. The golden hue slowly faded from his eyes, leaving behind a profound, devastating exhaustion. He released her throat, stumbling backward, as if the contact burned him. He braced both hands on the edge of the sink, bowing his head. "He struck first," David choked out. It was a visceral, ugly sound. Lisa rubbed her neck, staying against the wall. "Elias?" "All of them," David rasped, looking up at the mirror, refusing to meet her eyes. The ambush wasn't rogues. It was the vanguard, my own men. We walked into the gorge, and Elias gave the order. 30 silver-laced blades drawn on their king. "Why?" Lisa whispered, the sheer scale of the treason horrifying her. The vanguard were the elite, sworn by blood oath. "The human accords," David said, turning around to face her. The bitterness in his voice was absolute. "Elder Thomas and the council. They want to expand the hunting grounds. They want to dissolve the human sanctuaries. I refused to sign the treaty." Lisa's breath hitched. The human sanctuaries. The only reason her family, her sisters, lived in peace on the eastern border. "They bought Elias with the promise of a seat on the council," David continued, his voice dropping to a hollow monotone. "They cornered me. They thought silver nets and numbers would be enough. They didn't count on the beast." He looked down at his hands, scarred and stained with phantom blood. "I didn't just kill them, Lisa. I slaughtered them. I tore Elias apart while he begged for his father. I am exactly the monster the council claims I am." Lisa stared at the broken king. He had committed the ultimate pack taboo, spilling the blood of his own, but he had done it to stop a genocide against her kind. The moral complexity of it settled heavily over the room. She stepped away from the wall. She walked over to the tray, picked up the silver pin, and walked over to a biohazard disposal bin. She dropped the pin inside, where it landed among blood-soaked gauze and ruined syringes. "It was lost in the mud," Lisa said, her voice hard, resolute. The rogues took it as a trophy. David stared at her, stunned by her complicity. If they find out you know, they will kill you too. The council leaves no loose ends. Then we better make sure they don't find out, Lisa said, stepping back up to the exam table and picking up the suturing needle. Sit down, Alpha. We have work to do. 48 hours later, the tension in the compound had mutated from panic to a suffocating funeral dirge. David stood in the center of his private quarters, staring into a full-length mirror. He was forcing himself into a tailored, charcoal gray suit. The fabric pulled agonizingly across his chest, where Lisa's sutures held his flesh together through sheer force of will and medical tape. Every movement was a study in concealed agony, but his face remained a mask of flawless, terrifying stone. You shouldn't be upright, Lisa said from the doorway, holding a medical kit. Your white blood cell count is erratic. The silver from their blades poisoned your system deeper than we thought. If you stand in that great hall for an hour, you will collapse. If I don't stand in that great hall, David replied, adjusting his cuffs without looking at her, Elder Thomas will declare me unfit to rule, invoke emergency powers, and sign the accords by midnight. He turned to face her. He looked majestic, lethal, and entirely pale. I'm coming with you, Lisa said, stepping into the room. David frowned. Absolutely not. The pack is mourning. Humans are barred from pack rights. It's too dangerous for you to be in a room with 500 grieving wolves. I am the chief medical officer of this compound, Lisa fired back, lifting her chin. By pack law, I am permitted to act as a medical proxy if the Alpha is under active treatment. I am standing behind you, David. If you start bleeding through that $3,000 suit, I'm the only one who can patch you up before they smell it. David stared at her, the corner of his mouth twitching in what might have been a ghost of a smile. You are incredibly stubborn for a fragile creature. I survived washing your beast, she replied evenly. I can survive a memorial service. The Great Hall was a cavernous, ancient structure of dark oak and vaulted ceilings. As David entered, with Lisa a respectful 3 paces behind his right shoulder, a heavy, oppressive silence fell over the massive crowd. 500 wolves turned their glowing, predatory eyes toward their king. The grief in the room was a physical weight, thick with the scent of salt, sorrow, and simmering rage. At the front of the hall, upon a raised dais, stood Elder Thomas and the rest of the pack council. Beside them stood Marcus. The beta looked hollowed out, staring at the empty wooden casket that symbolized his lost son. David walked down the center aisle. He didn't limp. He didn't falter. He projected absolute dominance, burying the agonizing pain of his ribs beneath layers of Alpha command. Lisa matched his pace, keeping her eyes fixed on his broad back, acutely aware of the hostile stares burning into her skin. David reached the dais and offered a brief, respectful nod to the empty casket, then turned to face his pack. We have suffered a devastating blow, Elder Thomas's voice boomed out, amplifying through the hall. The elder stepped forward, his eyes fixed on David. It wasn't a look of shared grief, it was a look of predatory anticipation. The Vanguard, our finest sons, butchered by rogues. A failure of intelligence, a failure of protection. The slight on David's leadership was thinly veiled. The crowd shifted uneasily, but Thomas continued, raising a hand, his lips curling into a triumphant sneer. The goddess does not abandon her faithful. In the darkest night, a miracle has occurred. Lisa saw David's posture stiffen imperceptibly. A cold dread settled in her stomach. The rogues were brutal, but they were careless, Thomas proclaimed. He gestured to the heavy oak doors at the side of the dais. They did not kill everyone in the gorge. The doors groaned open. 2 council guards dragged a figure into the light. It was a young wolf, barely out of his teenage years. He was severely beaten, his leg heavily splinted, his clothes torn and stained with dried mud and blood. But he was alive. Lisa recognized him from the medical files. Julian, one of Elias's lieutenants. A collective gasp echoed through the hall. Marcus lunged forward, falling to his knees before the battered boy. Julian! By the gods! How? Julian was trembling violently. He didn't look at Marcus. He didn't look at Elder Thomas. His wide, terrified eyes found David standing in the center of the dais. Lisa watched the monitor on her smartwatch, synced to the biometric patch she had hidden beneath David's collar. His heart rate, previously a steady, suppressed rhythm, violently spiked into the red zone. The trap was sprung. David hadn't killed them all. He had left a witness. "Tell them, boy," Elder Thomas urged softly, a vicious gleam in his eye as he looked directly at the Alpha King. "Tell the pack who slaughtered your commander. Tell them what happened in the gorge." The silence in the Great Hall was absolute, a heavy, suffocating vacuum that seemed to suck the oxygen straight from Lisa's lungs. 500 pairs of predatory eyes were fixed on the trembling, broken boy on the floor. On Lisa's wrist, the digital face of her smartwatch flashed an angry, silent red. 150 beats per minute. 160 beats per minute. David's heart was hammering against his shattered ribs. He stood perfectly still, his charcoal suit immaculate, but she could see the minuscule tremor in his clenched jaw. The beast was battering against the cage of his ribs, desperate to shift, desperate to tear the throat out of the elder who had cornered them. "Speak, Julian," Elder Thomas coaxed, his voice dripping with faux paternal warmth. He stepped closer to the edge of the dais. "You are safe now, in the house of your ancestors. Tell us how the Alpha King abandoned his mind and slaughtered your brothers." Julian slowly lifted his head. His face was a patchwork of deep purple bruises and swollen lacerations. He looked at the empty oak casket, tears cutting clean tracks through the grime on his cheeks. Then he looked at Marcus, his beta, whose face was a mask of desperate, pleading grief. Finally, Julian's gaze shifted to David. Lisa watched the silent exchange. She expected to see David's eyes flashing with that terrifying, chaotic gold, threatening the boy into silence. But they weren't. David's eyes were a deep, sorrowful gray. He was looking at the boy he had spared in the gorge, the boy who had dropped his silver blade in sheer terror before the beast could strike him down. David was offering no threats, only the grim resignation of a king ready to face the executioner. Julian swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing in his bruised throat. "It was an ambush," Julian rasped, his voice echoing thinly off the vaulted ceilings. "But it wasn't rogues." Elder Thomas smiled thinly. "Yes. Go on. Tell them who it was." "It was mercenaries," Julian said, his voice gaining a fraction of strength. "Hired guns. And our own vanguard." A ripple of confusion swept through the hall. Marcus stepped forward, his brow furrowing. "Julian, what are you saying? The vanguard was ambushed by mercenaries." "No, Alpha Marcus," Julian choked out, a sob finally breaking free. He pointed a shaking, blood-crusted finger directly at Elder Thomas. "The vanguard worked with the mercenaries, under his orders." The great hall erupted. It was a physical wall of sound, snarls, shouts of disbelief, and the terrifying scrape of claws unsheathing against the floorboards. "Silence!" Elder Thomas roared, his face flushing violently red. He waved frantically at his council guards. "The boy's mind is broken. The beast's terror has made him delirious. Take him to the cells." "Elias gave the order," Julian screamed over the chaos, scrambling backward on his good leg to avoid the advancing guards. "He told us Elder Thomas promised him a seat on the council if the king was removed. He told us to draw silver on the Alpha." Marcus froze, the blood draining entirely from his face. My son drew silver." "We all did," Julian cried, weeping openly now. But the mercenaries betrayed us. When the king shifted, they locked the gorge behind us. They trapped the vanguard in the valley with the beast. They didn't care who died, as long as the king fell. Elias realized we were just bait. He died trying to fight the mercenaries off, not the king. Lisa's smartwatch vibrated wildly against her wrist. 180 beats per minute. "Treason!" Thomas shrieked, panic finally cracking his polished veneer. He realized he was losing control of the narrative. He pointed fiercely at David. "He is a monster. The boy lies to protect his life. Guards, seize the king. He is unfit to rule." Two of the heavily armed council guards lunged toward David, silver-laced batons drawn. Lisa didn't think. Instinct, raw and terrifying, took over. She stepped forward, throwing herself directly into the path of the guards, her hands raised. "Stop! If you touch him, his heart will give out." But before the guards could even register the fragile human in their path, a sound ripped through the hall that shook the very foundations of the building. It wasn't a wolf's snarl. It was a king's roar. David moved with a speed that defied the agonizing trauma inflicted upon his body. He stepped around Lisa, grabbing the nearest guard by the tactical vest and hurling him off the dais with a terrifying, effortless surge of strength. The guard crashed into the oak pews 20 feet away, splintering the wood upon impact. The second guard froze, his baton hovering in the air. David stood center stage. He didn't shift into the massive black wolf. He didn't need to. He unleashed the full, suffocating weight of his alpha aura. It hit the room like a physical shockwave. Lisa gasped, falling to one knee as the sheer, oppressive gravity of his dominance pressed down on her lungs. It felt like standing at the bottom of the ocean. Around the hall, 500 wolves hit the floor, dropping to their knees or throwing themselves onto their stomachs, whining in involuntary submission to their absolute sovereign. "I am your king!" David's voice boomed, layered with a low, vibrating growl that vibrated in Lisa's teeth. "I endured the silver of my own men. I drowned in the blood of traitors to protect this pack from a war you orchestrated." He turned his blazing, storm-gray eyes on Elder Thomas. The elder was struggling to remain standing, his knees knocking together, blood slowly beginning to trickle from his nose under the crushing psychic pressure of the Alpha's command. "You sold my vanguard," David snarled, taking a slow, terrifying step toward the elder. With every breath, Lisa saw a dark, wet stain blooming across the chest of his immaculate charcoal suit. The sutures were tearing. He was literally ripping himself apart to hold the room. "You poisoned Marcus's son with ambition, and then you locked them in a cage with the dark to ensure no witnesses survived. He is a human sympathizer." Thomas spat weakly, falling to his knees as his legs finally gave out. "He would sacrifice our hunting grounds for their kind." "I protect the Accords because I am not a mindless butcher," David said coldly. "A lesson you failed to learn." David stopped 2 feet from the cowering elder. The hall was dead silent, save for the ragged, agonizing breaths tearing from the Alpha's chest. The stain on his suit was spreading rapidly, turning the fine gray wool black. Marcus slowly pushed himself up from the floor. The beta was weeping, his eyes glowing a fierce, heartbroken amber. He looked at Julian, then at the empty casket, and finally at Thomas. The betrayal of his son, and the man who orchestrated it, warring in his soul. Marcus drew his sidearm. He racked the slide with a deafening clack, aiming it squarely at Elder Thomas's head. "Alpha," Marcus said, his voice a gravelly, broken whisper. "Your orders." David swayed. The adrenaline was evaporating, leaving only the agonizing, silver-laced trauma behind. He looked at Marcus, acknowledging the beta's loyalty despite the devastating truth about his son. "Throw him in the deep cells," David rasped, his voice losing its supernatural resonance. "He will face the council tribunal under Truthbane." "With pleasure," Marcus growled, signaling the remaining loyal pack guards to seize the screaming, thrashing elder. As Thomas was dragged from the hall, the oppressive alpha aura instantly vanished. The crushing weight lifted from the room. David turned back toward Lisa. The terrifying, majestic king was gone, replaced instantly by a man running on fumes. His face was the color of chalk. The dark stain on his chest had soaked through his jacket. "Lisa," he breathed, a threat of absolute vulnerability in his voice. His eyes rolled back, and the Alpha King collapsed like a felled oak. "David!" Lisa screamed, breaking every protocol, every rule of pack hierarchy. She dove across the dais, sliding on her knees to catch his head before it cracked against the hardwood. She ripped open his ruined suit jacket, her hands instantly slick with his blood. The deep tissue sutures had blown completely. He was hemorrhaging. She looked up at the stunned, kneeling pack. "Don't just stare at him," she roared with an authority that rivaled the king's. "Get a stretcher. Now." The rhythmic, electronic blip of the heart monitor was the only sound in the private recovery suite. The harsh fluorescent lights had been dimmed, casting the room in a soft, amber glow. Lisa sat in a plastic chair beside the bed, her elbows resting on her knees, her face buried in her hands. She was still wearing the same scrubs, now heavily stained with a terrifying amount of the king's blood. It had taken 4 hours of surgery, 2 massive transfusions of synthetic shifter plasma, and 50 new sutures to put him back together. She heard the rustle of the high thread count sheets. Lisa raised her head. David was awake. He lay on his back, an oxygen cannula resting beneath his nose. His chest was heavily bandaged, but the sickly gray pallor had faded from his skin, replaced by the warm, healthy flush of an alpha, whose healing factor was finally taking hold, free from the taint of silver. He slowly turned his head to look at her. His gray eyes were clear, sharp, and entirely focused. "You ruined my suit," he murmured. His voice was weak, scratchy from the intubation tube, but a dry, faint humor lingered at the edges of his words. Lisa let out a wet, exhausted laugh, wiping a stray tear from her cheek with the back of her wrist. "It was a cheap suit anyway." Silence stretched between them, thick but no longer suffocating. It was a comfortable, earned quiet. The storm had passed. The compound was secure. Thomas was in chains, and Marcus had personally secured the perimeter. David reached up, slowly pulling the oxygen cannula from his nose. He let his hand fall to the edge of the mattress, inches from where Lisa sat. "You stood in front of the guards," he said softly. "You have no wolf, no armor. They would have crushed you, Lisa." "I told you," she replied, picking up a clean, damp linen cloth from a basin of warm water on the bedside table. "I'm your medical proxy. You were spiking. I was just doing my job." David watched her as she leaned forward, gently dabbing a smudge of dried blood from the edge of his jawline. It was a mirror of their first encounter in the courtyard, but the context had entirely shifted. She wasn't washing away the gore of a mindless beast to find the man beneath. She was tending to a king who had broken himself to protect his people, and hers. "The Accords?" he asked quietly, leaning into the warmth of the cloth. "Signed," Lisa confirmed, a soft smile touching her lips. "Marcus acted as your proxy. The human sanctuaries are safe, permanently." David exhaled a long breath, a profound relief settling into the rigid lines of his face. He looked at her hand, the one holding the cloth. He reached out and gently wrapped his large, warm fingers around her wrist. It was the exact same place he had grabbed her in the infirmary 2 days ago, but there was no bruising pressure this time. Only a deep, anchoring gentleness. "I was terrified," David confessed, a truth he would never utter to another living soul. in the gorge, when the beast took over. I thought I had lost my mind to the blood." "You didn't," Lisa said, her thumb lightly brushing the back of his hand. "You did what you had to do. You survived." "I survived because you didn't run away when I brought the nightmare home," he corrected her, his gray eyes locking onto hers with an intensity that made her breath hitch. "You weren't afraid of the beast." "I was terrified of the beast," Lisa admitted with a soft chuckle. "But I knew the man underneath was worth the risk." David's hand slid down from her wrist, his fingers intertwining loosely with hers. It was a quiet, profound surrender. The Alpha King, who demanded submission from all, was offering his own vulnerability to the one woman who had seen his darkest moment and refused to look away. "Stay," David whispered, his thumb tracing the knuckles of her hand. It wasn't an Alpha's command. It was a request. Lisa looked at his hand holding hers, feeling the steady, powerful pulse of his heartbeat through his skin. She placed the wet cloth on the bedside table and leaned back in her chair, refusing to let go of his grip. "I'm not going anywhere, David," she said softly. "Someone has to make sure you don't pop your stitches again." David closed his eyes, a faint, genuine smile finally breaking across his face. For the first time in his reign, the Alpha King rested in absolute peace, watched over by the woman who had tamed the monster simply by caring for the man. She washed the Alpha King's beast proves that the most profound strength isn't always found in fangs and claws, but in the quiet courage to offer healing when the world demands violence. Lisa's clinical calm tamed David's feral trauma, bridging the gap between a fragile human and an invincible king, proving that even monsters need a sanctuary. If this high-stakes tale of loyalty, betrayal, and slow-burn romance kept you on the edge of your seat, please like the story, share it with your fellow dark romance and shifter fiction readers, and subscribe to follow our author page for more thrilling, immersive chapters and upcoming novels.